Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We have the privilege of studying Haftarah this week. This week's Haftarah is bumped off for Shabbos Chanukah. It's unique in that Parashat Vayeshev is typically not Chanukah. Typically, Parashat Miketz is. So next week we'll be able to study Parashat Miketz and the Haftarah for Parashat Miketz, which typically doesn't exist because it's replaced by the Haftarah for Chanukah. So it's a unique year in that there is only one Shabbos Chanukah, and that's Parshas Vayeshev and not Parshas Miketz. So that's unique. That said, I want to be, as they say in Hebrew, mit yaches. I want to address for a moment the Haftarah that we're not reading, which is Parshas Vayeshev, and then we'll dive into the Haftarah for Chanukah, which we are reading, which is from Zechariah, chapter 2, verse 14, through chapter 4, verse 7, which in your Stone Commission on page 1210. But before we do that, let's just talk about the Haftarah we would have read if it was not Chanukah, which is from the one and only book of Amos, for those who back at home, my personal favorite Navi. And in particular, it's the beginning. It's a freeze frame from the very beginning of Parashat Amos, which is not Parashat, the book of Amos, the Navi Amos, which is a long list of sins that different people are taken accounted for, different nations. In particular, we highlight, it goes through of this, and that actually references a lot of geography of the land of Israel, in particular the Gaza area in the Parsha, in the Navi. But we pick up in the middle. This is Parak Bet, verse 6, that says, "Kol Amar Hashem al shosha peshei Yisrael va'arba lo ashivena." For the four sins of Israel and the three sins of Israel and the four, there'll be no redemption. What exactly that means in that phrase, in that form, which repeats itself over and over again, is not we're going to get into right now. On the Charam Bekesef Tzaddik, for selling a tzaddik, the righteous, for the Evyom Bavor Manalayim. You sell out the righteous for money and the destitute for a pair of sandals. Shofim al far eretz, barosh dalim, that you walk on the heads of the poor, and the ways of the humble and the needy. Yit'u, you pervert. Bish va'aviv yelchu el hanara, and a father and son go to perform profane acts with a woman. Leman chalel et shem kochi, in order to defile God's name. And we see over here sort of a combination of moral, ethical, religious sin that brings together all these pieces. And it goes on and on the different sins that happens and what's going to happen. God's going to destroy Yerushalayim. V'anochi hashmed, v'anochi hishmadeti et ha'amorim mipnechem. I knocked out all the other nations to bring you to Israel, and this is what you do. And I made you Vakim mivnechem lizviim. I made your children to be prophets, and from your choice firstborns, and not firstborns, but young men, Lenizirim, to be a Nazir, to have this connection with God. But you made the Nazir drink wine, obviously a violation of that. And the prophets, you commanded them, don't prophesize. And so he says bad things are going to happen, right? Hinei anochi meik taftechem. I'm going to destroy you. You're going to lose anything. The chazek lo yamitz kocho. Even the strong won't have any strength. V'kivor limalet b'nafsho, and the courageous won't escape with their soul. It's bad. Bad stuff is going to happen. Listen to this, and basically it's just a series of bad things that will happen to the Jewish people. And what's interesting to note, and I note every year, but it's so important now, and I say it actually on the flip side of what it typically is when we talk about it, is what's interesting is when you read this Haftorah, it is all bad. There's nothing good about the Haftorah, right? There's no nivuah of consolation. There's no upside. There's no nechama. There's nothing, right? And that does not match what is our criterion for Haftorah. And as Rabbi Soloveitchik famously would always point out, that actually is by design. This is the exception to the rule, that Parshas Vayeshev is the one Parsha where the Haftorah does not have any upside, doesn't have any redeeming quality. There's no comfort, there's no consolation, there's no anything. Because what happens in Parshas Vayeshev, Parsha Vayeshev, while there are many Parshiot where Jews do wrong, in a moment where a Jew sells another Jew into exile, sells a Jew to slavery, so in that moment, there can be no redemption. Right? Without that unity, without that connectiveness, without that responsibility one to another, there's no redemption. So even the Haftorah that we read on Tisha B'Av speaks about redemption, right? The temple can be destroyed, it can be burning to the ground, but there can be still hope for redemption. But when we treat our fellow inappropriately, then there's no, the Haftorah reads this Jeremiah of terrible things to befall the people with no hope. And I think, typically we talk about this as a need for greater unity. But obviously in the world we're living in right now, it just reminds us of how important the unity that we have is, and how important we hold on to that unity, and how important it is that we show that we care about our brother and our sister, even if they're a little different. And that being the case. So that's the Haftorah. We're not going to spend too much time on that Haftorah. That's the Haftorah that we missed this week, and we'll go from there. Let us look at our Haftorah. So our Haftorah is from Zechariah, as opposed to Amos that is talking during the first temple, and primarily is talking to the northern kingdom. So early in the first temple period, the Haftorah for Hanukkah is from Zechariah, and Zechariah is a prophet of not the first, but the beginning of the second temple, post-destruction, as the Jewish people are trying to come back. And that is the frame in which our Haftorah begins. Zechariah himself is a connection of a number of 13 confounding visions that he's not able to fully understand. We get a couple of them in our Haftorah, and that's where we'll begin, chapter 2, verse 14. Rani v'simchi. By the way, if it sounds familiar, this Haftorah isn't just read on Shabbos Chanukah, but when else would you imagine read Haftorah that will be connected to the menorah, to the Chanukiah?
The dedication of the temple, of the Mishkan?
That would be an interesting guess.
Parashat
Ba'alotcha. Thank you, Ron. Ba'alotcha, Parashat Ba'alotcha, which refers to the dedication, you're right, Lee, of the lighting of the menorah, right? So Rani v'simchi bat Zion kihineni ba v'shachanti b'tochech ni'um Hashem. Be shout for joy, O Israel, and be excited, O bat Zion. Why? Because God is coming and will dwell in your midst. V'shachanti b'tochem b'tochech, and will dwell within your midst, declares God. And right off the bat, while many connect this Haftorah to Hanukkah because of the image that will come up later on about the image of the menorah, if you just skip with me a little bit to chapter 4, verse 1, Vayeshev hamalach hadober bi, the angel spoke to me, Vayireni ki ish asher ye'or mishnato, like someone who was awakening me from my sleep. meaning the prophet is sort of struggling to keep up, to stay up, to figure out what's going on. It's a leitmotif that happens throughout this part. He says, what do you see? Omar, and I say, Ra'iti v'hinei menorat zahav kula. There's this image of the menorah that's totally gold. V'gula al rosha, and there's a bowl above it. V'shiva neroteha aleha, and there are 7 lamps that are on it. Shiva v'shiva musakot ala nerot asher al rosha. There are 7 pipes of the 7 indentations that are on the menorah, right? So this is the image. Ushnei zeitim, and there are 2 olive branches or olive trees. Aleh echad mimina gula, v'echad al shmala. One on the right of the bowl, one on the left of the bowl. Right? If you're trying to figure out what this looks like, this is the symbol, the symbol of the state of Israel. Menorah in the middle, olive branch on one side, olive branch on the other side. That's where it comes from over here. Vayan vayomer al hamalach ado Rabbi lemor ma ela adoni. And I turned to the angel and I said, what are these? I don't know. Help me understand what this is. And the angel sort of continues and attacks him. Vayan hamalach ado Rabbi. The angel who's speaking to me said, vayomer elai. He said to me, Halo yadata ma ela. Do you not know what this is? And the answer is, of course not. That's why I'm asking you. Omar, and I said, Lo Adoni, I do not know. Right? There's sort of this denigrating of Zechariah and his prophecy that we see in this Haftarah. Either way, right? We can understand why this gets chosen to talk about the menorah when we're talking about Hanukkah, right? Because there's this image of the menorah, right? What I would like to suggest, perhaps, is that more than that, it is the beginning part of this Haftarah that really sets the stage as part of what the prophet is talking about. What's the context here? What is this idea that gets started that we need to say, Rani v'simchi, be happy and joyful, O Zion, because God's going to dwell in you. V'shachanti b'tochem, b'tochech. I'm going to live within you. I'm going to dwell within you, which is the same language that we use in the Torah to describe dwelling in the tabernacle. Is that what's happening here, just historically, that the Jews are invited back to go to build back the second temple, but it's very fraught. It gets after they build the mizbeach, the altar, it gets stopped. The process gets stopped. It gets frozen. And they're not able to really continue for several years. And now it's getting restarted. There are 2 prophets that help initiate that restart. One is Zechariah, and the other is Haggai. And their message is to that this will be able to dwell within the Jewish people. That God will. This is the moment where God will come to dwell within the Jewish people. And one of the images that describes that, or one of the challenges for that, is if you think about the temple and what captures God's presence, the Shekhinah, if you read just all the traditional sources.
The ark.
The ark, exactly. Over and over again, we'll read throughout the Torah, that God will speak to the Jewish people, kruvim, between the cherubs that are on the ark. Over and over again, that is the symbol of God's presence. Is there an ark in the second temple? It's long gone, long disappeared. And the question becomes, what convenes the presence of God? And one of the perhaps themes that exists is that it is actually the menorah that will convene the presence of God. It's actually the menorah that will convene. There's a Braita, which is a rabbinic teaching that didn't quite make it into the Mishnah, that describes exactly this idea. It asks, how come in the desert do we have to light the candelabra, the menorah? Don't we know that God's image or God's light was with the Jewish people throughout, right? Don't we know that they traveled be'amud anan yomam by a pillar of the cloud during the day, u'b'amud eish laila, and a fire at night? So why do they have to light the menorah? So Midrash, this is quoted in the Talmud, Shabbat 22b. The Gemara says, And this is, by the way, in the My Hanukkah conversation, like right in when we talk about Hanukkah. The Gemara says, hold on. Finding it. Sorry. Amar Meitziv Rosh Sheshet. Rosh Sheshet asks the following question: Michutz la parochet ha'idut yaroch. That outside the veil, the curtain of the tent of meeting, meaning outside the Kadosh Kodashim, you should every evening establish to light the menorah forever. That you should do that. Is it needed for the light? Right, to God, do we need to light the menorah for the light of the tabernacle? Hello, Kol Arba'im Shana. Wasn't it for the old 40 years that they traveled in the desert? Shalchu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar, that the Jewish people went in the desert. Lo halchu ela la'oro. Did they not travel rather but the light of God? Meaning the Amud Ha'esh, the pillar of God. By the way, you hear the language. The language is all Hebrew. There's no Aramaic that I just quoted. This is a Braita, a Mishnaic statement. And so there is no Hebrew there because they're still speaking in Hebrew. If it was the Talmudic approach, something else, then that would be have more Aramaic in it. Ela edut hi l'bayei olam she'ashchina shoreh b'Yisrael. Rather, it is testimony that within the Jewish people, to all the world, that within the Jewish people rests God's presence. Right? Right? So what's going on here? So perhaps what I would like to suggest is part of what the message of the Haftarah is telling us is that the significance of the menorah, and maybe even the significance of the miracle of the menorah in the Chashmonaim period, was not just lighting the menorah because the menorah was a functional part of the temple, but because in a world where there was no Aron and no Luchot and no Kruvim, no Ark, no tabernacle, no tablets, and no cherubs, what convened the spark of God's spirit? What convened the Shekhinah? The menorah. And so lighting the menorah, kindling the menorah, not settling for poor oil or inferior oil or non-holy oil, was a representation, a symbol, not just to the Jewish people, but to everyone around, that the Shekhinah rested within the people. And how do we express that? Right here, beginning of Torah. Rani v'simchi bat Zion. What's the joy of Hanukkah? Not the menorah. The menorah is the point, but it's the tool, it's the vessel, that God can dwell within us. V'novu goyim rabim el Hashem. And all the nations of the world will come close to God at that day. Right? It's a very odd thing to be saying in a time where the Jews are being opposed by all the nations around them about building the temple. What's this language? Again, the same thing. Listen to the Braita. It's not to the Jewish people. It's testimony. It's proof, evidence for all the people of the world. What's our Torah continue? V'novu goyim rabim el Hashem. All these nations will join, attached to you, to God. Vayomahu on that day, vayu li la'am, and you will be for me a nation. V'shachanti b'tocheach, and I'll dwell within you. What's the end of the equation? What's the terminal point of all these things? God's presence being within the Jewish people. And that perhaps is a subtle message of the menorah. Right? We don't think about it that way. But right embedded in the first verses of the Haftarah that's chosen to frame the entire vision of the menorah is perhaps what Chazal is telling us is the point of the menorah, is the point of the miracle, to have a way to integrate God's presence within the Jewish people. The Shachan Ti, which is what the Torah refers to also, the Tochech, within the Jewish people, so that God can be part of the holy camp that is our lives. Right? So when we read these first two verses, you sort of think about it's just a setup to get us to 21 verses so we can read about the prophecy about the menorah, but that's not the case. V'nachal Hashem et Yehuda chalko al admat hakodesh u'bachar od Yerushalayim. And God will choose Judah, which is now really the term for all the Jewish people. There aren't other besides for Judah that exists. And God will choose further in Yerushalayim. Has kol basar l'pnei Hashem ki ni'er me'on kodsho. Be silent, be still, all the people, for God is awaking from God's holy inhabitants, holy space, holy sort of, the removed station of God. Again, this image of God sort of waking up, quote unquote, from the heavens and coming down to dwell within the people. I will just note this language of Has kol basar, is a very strong sort of image, dramatic image. Be silent before God. It comes up one or two times in other places, Habakkuk and others, and perhaps it's connected to that. We're not going to talk about that right now, but perhaps it's connected to that. That's the first part. Now we have the next part, right? Now we have the different visions, or some of the visions of Zechariah. The next vision, Vayireni Yoshua Kohen HaGadol. God shows Zechariah, Yeshua the Kohen HaGadol, Omed Lefnei HaMalach, standing before the Malach of God. Satan Omed Al Yemino L'Sitno. And God, and there's the angel, the accuser, another angel of God is accusing him before God, is prosecuting him. Vayomer Hashem El HaSatan. God said to the accuser, Yigar Hashem B'chach HaSatan. God should rebuke you, O accuser. Yigar Hashem Bach. Bach Habocher B'Yushalayim. And God, who chooses Jerusalem, should silence you. Halozeh ud mutzal mi'esh. This is an ud mutzal mi'esh. That's a very hard term to explain, to translate. What does your translation say? I mean, it's not a hard word to explain. There are English words for each of those words. The question is, what does it mean? How do they translate in the Art Scroll?
Chabad has it, a brand plucked from fire.
A brand plucked from fire. That's what I have also. What does that mean? What does that mean? Why should the accuser stop accusing him of his misdeeds because he's a brand plucked from fire? So why does this mean? Is a brand plucked from fire?
Something that's saved from having been consumed, from destruction, I think.
So Rabbi, it seems to me that perhaps he's just saying that this is a powerful spirit, a powerful soul, and he was in a bad situation. And now he's being taken back from that situation.
So I think you might be referring to similar what the Malbim says. The Malbim says that even though he might be worthy of accusation, he might be worthy of prosecution, he might have committed things that he needs to be held for account for, because of the strength of his personality, of who he is, God saving him, just like a brand, a metal brand in the fire can still maintain its shape even when it's heated and it's under intense heat. So too, God's sort of going to insulate him because of his strong personality, of his strong ability, and maybe even his impact that he will have on others, right? What's the function of a brand? To brand others, right? Others suggest that really it actually has to do with sort of less about that, but more the image of being plucked from destruction, right? Yoshua the Kohen Gadol is the grandson of lines of Kohanim that almost get wiped out in the destruction of the first temple. His great grandfather or his grandfather is executed. There are many Kohanim left, and so this line is important. God's saving him not because he deserves it, but because otherwise the line would disappear. So he's plucked from the fire as if it's being consumed. Meaning it's not that brand can withstand the fire. It's the opposite. It will melt, and God is taking out of the fire so that he will be successful. One other answer given is that it's because just like the metaphor is to highlight that he hasn't been warned yet, right? Now he's going to be admonished. If he doesn't listen, once he's admonished, then you can have your accusation. Let's admonish him first. What do we admonish him for? V'Yoshua haya levosh begadim tsoim. He's wearing the filthy garments, the dirty garments, and standing before the angel. Vayan vayomer haomdim lefanav lemor asira begadim hatsoim me'alav. Take off from him all the filthy clothes that he have on him. Vayomer elav re'ei. He said to him, "See, havarti me'alayich avonayich. I am removing from you your guilt, the sins that you have, your transgressions, the helvash otcha, and I am adorning you. I'm dressing you in priestly clothing, in this priestly clothing. Va'omar yasimu seems to her our show, put a pure sniff, the head garment of the Kohen on his head. V'suma seems to her our show. And they dressed him. Umalach Hashem omed, and the angel stood by. Right. So, what exactly is the sins that he did? He's filthy, meaning is he ritually impure? Is it that he's just done misdeeds? This is a big debate. Not surprising. And it could be that it means he is. Maybe it's idolatry that's referring to, that some of the commentaries bring. It might be one of the big issues we hear about this in Ezra is that many of these Kohanim are intermarried. They're not married properly, and that becomes the challenge. But all of those seem to be part of this piece and part of this question. Vayad Malach Hashem b'Yoshua lemor, and the angel charged Yoshua saying, what does he have to do? But Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot, so says the Lord, Im Zerachai Telech, if you go in God's ways and you perfect God's charge, V'gam Atzad Tzadin et Beiti, V'gam Tishmor Chatzerai, and you judge and guard God's home, Natadi Lacha Ma'alchem Dem Omdim Ha'ela. I will give you the chance to be successful between these two pillars, whether that means Zechariah and Zerubbabel, the two leaders, the religious and the political leader, or it means maybe some of the political leaders of the non-Jewish nations. It's a big debate. Let's just jump to we don't have so much time. Let's just jump to the image that we just saw of the menorah, chapter 4. And I want to actually, there's an interesting way of looking at this, that some want to interpret this as actually being a forecast, a foreshadowing of the prophetic moment of the Chashmonai, right? Of the miracle of Hanukkah, the Nes Pach HaShemen, of the oil lasting for 8 days. How do you read that in? Vayeshev, verse 1, Hamalach, the angel wakes him up and tells him, like, what do you see? And what does he see? V'nei menorah zahav kula. He has a menorah. There's a beautiful menorah in front of him. V'gula al rosha, and there's a bowl on its head. We talked about it last year. V'gula is the gematria of 44. 44 is how many? Why is 44 significant when it comes to Hanukkah?
Candles we light, number of candles.
Exactly. It's how many candles. So maybe a reference to that. There are a lot of people who look for like references to Hanukkah in the Torah and in the Navi. But I'm going to take a little bit more shot level. So there's this bowl of oil in front of it. There's 7 pipes that pipe in the oil from the bowl into the menorah. Now, in a traditional menorah in the temple, what's the role of the Kohen? Not just to light it, but the actual mitzvah is the haktava, the preparation, the cleaning it out, the setting it out, the putting in the new oil and everything like that. Is there a need to clean this, to refill this oil? If you have sort of a reserve of oil with a pipe to it that then feeds the bowl, feeds each lamp? No, it lights on its own. It sustains on its own, right? So perhaps some want to suggest that this is really a reference to the Nes Pasach Hashem, the miracle that the oil lasted for more than 8 days, or lasted for 8 days, excuse me, by this idea that the way the menorah is constructed is that there's this bowl of oil, and there are these tubes that go to each one and that feed the lamp that no person needs to add to it. That seems to show that the oil is going to last for longer than it was supplied to last, right? Everyone sort of see that image? So some point out that this might actually be a reference to our Parsha, to Hanukkah. Let's just finish what this part is. Ushnei zeitim aleh. There are two zeitim, 2 olive branches on it. What are those things? So he says, verse number 4, Vayan hamalach el Vayan va'omar el hamalach adover bi le'mor ma'ila adoni. What are these? Zechariah says, what are they? I don't know what they are. Tell me, what are these represent? Vayan hamalach. The angel tells him and mocks him for not knowing that. And he actually doesn't give him his answer anymore. He doesn't give his answer right over here, but later on he'll tell you that they are the two appointed dignitaries of the Jewish people, meaning the high priest and the king, meaning they represent the power, the religious power, and the spirit, and the political power as part of this equation. Meaning, now if we put this all together, if the menorah represents God's spiritual presence within the Jewish people, on one side flanked by the political leadership, on the other side flanked by the religious leadership, so we understand how that becomes the semel, the model, the symbol for the Jewish people, because that is the perfect synergy that we're looking for. Political leadership, spiritual leadership, all tied together by God's presence in the middle. So let's just recap for a second, and then we'll take any questions. We saw the first part of the Haftarah that talks about God's presence being brought into the Jewish people. And we noted that that could just be a filler as we're getting to this prophecy. Don't we know we need a certain amount of verses? But the answer really is probably not. That it's a much more fundamental message, that part of the magic, the importance of the menorah that exists, the majestic miracle that the menorah represents, is this presence of God being reintroduced to the Jewish people, promised to the Jewish people, brought back to the Jewish people, and that's what it presents. And that's perhaps a message for all of us, what sort of the message of Hanukkah is about. Hanukkah might be referenced over here in this last image that we talked about right now also, this bowl that is feeding into the menorah that tells us what's happening as well. And as well, this sort of image of the political and the religious leadership being shared jointly and represented by the locus of where God's divine presence rests, which is through the menorah. All of that ties beautifully together in terms of what we aspire to, not just on Hanukkah, but the rest of the year. So we'll stop here. And next week, we'll learn a special Haftarah, which is Miketz, which we don't really get to study so often. So I'm very excited for that.